Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next session of the virtual conference. We're going to be talking with Anita Thompson. She speaks about tracing the trail of the Scarlet runner bean. Again, I'm Mike Bollinger, the Executive Director at Seed Savers Exchange, and I will be your host for this session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge our community agreements that I'm going to put up here for us to all see. And this is really important, folks. Our speakers and presenters are generously sharing their time with this organization, with all of you and this greater community. And it is of utmost importance that we are respectful, be curious, be patient, to speak from your own experience, avoid jargon, and really be conscious of intent versus impact. Make sure that you make space for the presenters as they speak of their experiences in this world, in the work that they're doing in their lives and in their communities. And really, embrace these agreements, please. This is our collective responsibility, and to create a safe space that is respectful, inclusive, and that provides the opportunity for empowerment for everybody. So thank you for keeping these in mind as we move forward. And special thanks to Rancho Gordo for sponsoring this session. Rancho Gordo is a specialty producer and seller of heirloom beans in California. Today we're here with Anita Thompson. Fortunate to have Anita back again. She was part of the community day on our day one. And Anita is an extension agent for the Navajo, Apache, and Northern Greenlee counties in Arizona. She works primarily with sheep and goat farmers, beginning farmers, and rancher education, native plant ecological restoration, and seed education. She's also a small-scale seed farmer who raises Nigerian dwarf goats. And Anita spends her time studying the pathway of local seed and food that has made its way to Arizona. So Anita, thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure and a joy to have you. So I will hand it over to you, and I will put your presentation up on stage, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm so blessed to be here. I did not get to catch the first presentation. I got to catch the end of it, and I am looking forward to going back and watching that. There's in that group was a lot of people that have inspired me, several people that have inspired me to be where I am today and working with seeds. They will probably never know it, but a huge thank you. And Vivian has always been an inspiration. Just seeing some of the work, especially with True Love Seeds. So I'm very, very, very thankful, and I'm going to go back and watch that. So really quick, I did not add a slide for a land acknowledgement, but I do want to say thank you to and acknowledge the Hopi and Dene and Apache tribes that I work with, and work on their land. I am so thankful that they are part of my life and a part of my work. And I honestly could not imagine having a better place to be and to learn with them. So I thank them so much. And I hope every day that when I work, I'm able to make strides from some of the things that I've been taught. So uh, I I'm so thankful to be here. Food pathways is huge, and food is very important, especially in my communities. We don't have a lot of it, and there's been a detour from food, from healthy, nutritious food into maybe some different choices, but it's cost based. And so if you go to the store and a cheap food is $2 and a fresh vegetable is $7, and you have $10, what are you going to buy more of to feed your family? And that is the story around a lot of different communities and cultures. So it's always been very important to me to understand and to place this at a very high point in my career and in my work that I do. I am very, very blessed to work with some family consumer health science agents who do a ton of work in our communities to help improve food access and to be able to actually teach people some food access. So why the scarlet runner bean? And I'll get into that. But my presentation is tracing the trail of a scarlet runner bean. And like Mike said, I am with Cooperative Extension. I am an agent in Navajo and Apache in northern Greenlee counties. I serve the northeastern part of Arizona. It was almost 100 up here. I am in a cooler area, and by cooler, we were only just about 100, where the valley was 113. So I mean, we do get a little cooler. So I am an agent that works, an extension agent that works. I work a lot in science-based education, and seeds is something that's very important to my communities, and it's very important to me. So it's a really, really good place to be. I'm also a farmer. Started out as a market gardener and sold my food at farmers markets. And then I found seed and fell in love with seed, and that's where my path has taken me. But I still do farm seed for specific companies and groups. And then I am downsizing my Nigerian dwarf herd a little bit. So now they're my grazings. They're my grazing buddies. But yeah, so getting into the presentation. Sorry, let me get to the right screen. So my trail. I grew up in the Rockies. I worked in the Sierras, and I trained doing a lot of vegetation management in the Appalachians. But I currently work and play on the Colorado Plateau and in the White Mountains of Arizona. So I'm very mountain focused. I'm not, like, the desert is there. I have spent time in the desert when I was in the military, and I have served. I was in the Army, and I served in Virginia and South Carolina and Arizona and Nevada and all these different places. But my heart is in the mountains. And then I did get my bachelor's in rangeland ecology and forest management from University of Nevada, Reno, and my master's in natural resource stewardship and ecological restoration from Colorado State University. I probably should have just gone into farming and saved all those years, but they do bring a piece to the puzzle, and I do love it. My ancestors were farmers, and my extended family are all gardeners. So I am technically a multi-generation farmer, except my dad decided to be an engineer instead of a farmer, which broke the train, and that's a huge issue with me. So if he would have just farmed, it would have been great. But instead, he decided to, do smart things and with engineering, and then so I ended up being a first-generation farmer again, which I'm 100% fine with. And my passion is growing arid-adapted heirlooms, varieties with a story, and historical gardening. So I am a huge plant nerd and a seed nerd. I love talking about them. So why the scarlet runner bean? What is my thing with the scarlet runner bean? So in 2020, I was like, hey, I'm going to grow out. I saw an ad for Native Seed Search, which is one of our local, and by local, I mean Tucson, seed companies. And I really wanted to get into maybe doing something more arid adapted. I was tired of dumping endless amounts of water into my farm. So I was like, okay, I'm going to reach out to them and see if I can grow some seed for them. And so they were like, yes, and here's some different varieties. I grew out a bunch of different melons and a bunch of different pumpkins and squashes, and it was really great. And there was this bag of scarlet runner beans. They're 4 corners scarlet runner beans. And I was like, I don't know what these are, but whatever. They're like gigantic, like small mammal sized seeds, just, whatever. How hard could that be? Well, scarlet runner beans are a little bit more technical than what are portrayed by maybe websites out there. They're like super easy to grow. You just put them in the ground. Yes, for flowers. For seeds, no. So you have to know your daylight time, your daylight length, and you have to know, like, they thrive at a certain time and then they don't thrive at a certain time. So there was a learning curve, and I did not do well in my first year. However, these seeds are beautiful, and I have an artistic brain, so I'm like, oh, these are gorgeous. So I was like, I'm going to learn all about them. And I fell completely in love with the flowers, with the plant, the seeds. I do have I have about 12 different colors of seed. We don't know varieties because there's so much cross-pollination in it, but I have like I have my seeds here. You can't probably see them, but there's like a gold and black one, and then I have like purple and black, which are the standard seeds, and then white is mixed in. And so I have all these different colors. I have red ones, I have different things like that. And so they're all locally grown by people who they're their family seed. And so yeah, I treasure the colors. I think they're amazing. I took a jar to the state fair, no, sorry, the county fair, and I got a blue ribbon because they're so pretty. And I was like, this is great. And then they're wild crop relative, which is one of my research areas. I work a lot with seed from wild crop relatives, and they just have a fascinating history. So yeah, we're going to kind of talk about that history a little bit. Oh, so what is a scarlet runner bean? So, and I do have to, because I have a brain injury, and I work with a lot of people like veterans and disabled law enforcement and things like that, where head injuries are common. We sound everything out, especially when it comes to botanical names. And I tell them no shame. A lot of people have been shamed into not saying the correct botanical term. And I don't do that. And I get corrected frequently. I don't take it personally, and I understand the meaning behind it, but there's times you can't form the syllable correctly. So I try to include pronunciations. So Phaseolus and cosinus. See, I can't even do it. So oh my goodness. Okay, we're moving on. Scarlet runner bean. So it's a perennial in its native range, but you can actually grow it as an annual, most likely. And we'll talk about the starchy root here in a second. It's a long day bean, which is why seeds are so hard sometimes if your timing is incorrect. It has a vining habit, and by vining, it can be up to 10 feet. Normally, 6 feet is more the average, sometimes 4 feet, depending on your soils. Can be indeterminate or determinate depending on the variety. So you either get that flush of beans, or you're going to go ahead and just get like beans as, a little bit at a time. Low temperature will kill the plant. And by low temperature, that's freezing temperatures. They do actually do better in a low temperature. They're not huge fans of heat. So in the native range, the tuber root, and then sometimes it's called a taproot, depending on what paper you read or what scientist you're talking to. It overwinters, and that root was actually food in its native range. So in some cases, there are growers that will actually harvest the root at the end of the season and then store it like you would like a dahlia or something, and then plant it and get an earlier flush. I don't do that because the time it takes to be able to keep track of those and make sure they stay alive through winter turned out to be like kind of cost prohibitive. So I just plant as an annual. And I'm not eating the root, so I don't want to maintain it for that. It is a diploid, so from a botanical standpoint, that is sexual reproduction, so it requires 2 plants. Beans are much larger than the common bean. So I always keep my beans close by, but if you can see, like right now, that's a pretty good sized bean, and that's one of my smaller beans. Like, they can get up to like an inch long, and I know it's so hard to see, but they can get like to an inch long. They're grown for food. They're so the pod, the early pod can actually be, before it gets really stringy, it's actually grown as a green bean. The flower has a I've never eaten the flower. I'm kind of scared too, but apparently it has like a bean flavor. And then the bean itself, and then the root. And then ornamental value is for pollinators, shade, and flowers. And then it does carry the PHA protein, which makes the raw or undercooked bean toxic. I guess there is a story though in some of the literature that this actually was one of the reasons that they sometimes, I believe it was the Mayan, not 100% sure, but one of the original growers of the plant used it to kill off any parasites in their system. And so because of this protein, I'm not saying don't do that, because we don't know, but that's what they used it for in the native range. It flowers readily, that they cross-pollinate. So if you want to maintain an heirloom variety, they need to have separation. And I've totally spaced looking up that separation. Pods can grow up to 10 inches long, and beans can be up to 1 inch long. Actually, like, so they can be up to 10 inches, but I normally see them around 6 inches. And a good pod will have like 5 or 6 beans in it. A lot of times you'll get 1 to 3. Those are the ones I don't save for seed. Those are the ones that go into the pantry for dinner. And the flowers are usually this really like scarlet red color, but they can be white, they can be pink, and then they can be purple or a lilac color. And previously, the species name was multiflora, so it is not that anymore. These are a list of other names. I am not going to attempt to pronounce most of them, but it does kind of drive kind of where the trail began and the trail is at. So a lot of these are from Aztec, Mexico, and then so once it moved over to Spain, it moved into kind of like a Spanish naming, and then the French even have the bean from Spain. I don't know where I was trying to find why the German translation is beetle bean. I found a few things, but they weren't like 100% scientific. So I was like, I'm not sure if I want to share those. But apparently beetle bean is the translation in Germany. And so it does have a lot of different names. This is one of the reasons why scientific names or botanical names are important. But again, pronunciation is always the hard part. So I'm sure you've seen these. They have the gorgeous colored beans, and then the flowers are just amazingly beautiful. Yeah, they're just a gorgeous plant. Now, one of the main ways that you're going to tell a scarlet runner bean from a common bean is how they germinate. And so there's an epigeel and a hypogeel germination. So epigeel, the cotyledons are above the ground. Hypogeel, the cotyledons are below the ground. So with the hypogeel, it protects the plant from grazing pressures. So right, all that nutrition is stored under the ground, so the plant can grow. However, in order for photosynthesis to occur, it needs its first true leaves. So if it gets grazed, it just sends up some new leaves, right? With epigeel, it gets a jump on photosynthesis immediately. So, but if it's grazed, it's done, right? So that is kind of one of the really interesting things when you're looking at a life history of a plant. How they actually either germinate and grow is so interesting, because if we're looking at a hypogeel germination, it means that it had a grazing pressure somewhere. At some point, it decided it didn't want to be grazed immediately, so it created this particular germination type. So, for me, it's like, okay, so where in its native range was it grazed that it had to do this? So that kind of opens up a little bit of a rabbit hole for me. I didn't go down that rabbit hole. That's for a later time. Origin story. So Mesoamerica, or Middle of the Americas. And that's a cultural and a historical term to identify an area or cultures that existed prior to Spanish encounters in the 1600s. So we're going to think of it now as more like Central America and Southern Mexico, kind of. So Nicaragua, Guatemala, Belize, I put twice, I don't know why, and others. That we're finding that the bean occurred in its native range naturally, so it was a wild plant, in the higher mountain areas. So it was warm and humid, slightly warm and slightly, but not hot. So it was like that, like nice little medium warm and humid area. Now, what it was cultivated, so you're taking your native plant, or you're taking your plant out of its natural habitat and cultivating it. That was likely cultivating in the highlands of Guatemala and southern Mexico. And that was probably because of the population centers there. When you look at the map, if you look at some of the older maps, that's the population centers of where they were actually most likely cultivated. There's not a true, like, this is where it was cultivated. So we're using a lot of historical evidence and reading through a lot of papers when I was trying to figure out how the path came up and over. So, I pulled some papers, and where, we're looking at where it started, right? So looking at, like, if we're looking at an archaeological investigation or expedition, they're basically looking at the late formative period, And that is going to basically, in that area, excuse me, and that's basically going to be 300 to 500 years, excuse me, I believe it's AD. So quite a while ago. And this is kind of some of the botanical remains that are recovered in this particular area. And in order to find these, there's a lot of different really cool ways that they determine the plant. And remember, this was in, I can't remember this one. I believe this particular paper was in the 1980s, maybe. I'd have to look. Normally I put the dates on them. But it's a flotation base and trying to find seeds. We didn't have a lot of the technology that we have now. So it'd be really cool to go back and look and see if there was actually more of different things. But for the scarlet runner beans, they found one instance in one area they were searching for in this mound. So that's evidence that it existed at that time. So 300 to 580. And then, of course, Botanical Museum leaflets with Harvard. So this is 1953. And this is by Robert L. Dressler. And he basically says in 1953, the species is known to be in the wild state in Mexico and Guatemala and is thought by the Russian workers, and I don't know the context to that, to have its center of diversity in Guatemala. It appears to be of some importance to both Mexico and Guatemala. The fleshy root may have been eaten. So we know that in 1953, someone said that it was known in the area. So that's why we're kind of putting together these pieces that it was very important and this is its natural habitat. And then just continuing on, I'm not going to throw too much sciencey stuff to take the time, but in the Ocampo caves, which were up in kind of like central Mexico, off the Gulf of Mexico, they did find a lot of different bean species and some gourds. So we do know at that point in time that in this particular cave and at that time and this was 1997, but when they were studying it, that this was actually documented in a find as existing. So, okay, so we've determined that that is in fact the area that it came from. So how do we get from Mesoamerica to where we are today? Well, the West Indies came into the story, and I had no idea where the West Indies were. I did past geography, but at the end of the day, that was a long time ago. So I had to Google the West Indies, and I learned that yes, they are basically Cuba, Bahamas, Caribbean, kind of that area is off the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So that was the West Indies to differentiate from the East Indies, which were on the other side of the world at the time. We're looking at the 1400s here, so descriptors are different. So, but how did they get to Europe? Well, I mean, there's not an actual line. Like there's no papers that are like Columbus came here or this person did this or this expedition did this. So they had to look at botanical guides. So this particular paper is great. It is the iconography of beans and related legumes following the Columbian exchange from James R. Myers, Alex Formiga, and Jules Janik. And it was written in 2022. And so they basically went and looked at all these botanicals from like the 1500s to I think the 1600s. And then they looked at like frescoes and things like that that were painted to actually determine bean species and where they went. So they were able to determine that these are the timelines where the beans probably moved from point A to point B and how they got around. So there was no expedition before 1492, 1493, right? Columbus had that expedition. Because of that, now that's the starting point. We're obviously discounting the fact that they could have come from another method, but this is what they're looking at from the botanicals and the frescoes. And the painted frescoes on like churches and things like that. So the theories right now are basically that this is the timeline that the beans came over, and they originally came to Spain, which is kind of what everyone had assumed, and then they were taken up to the UK and other European nations, and then they were brought around to Africa, and then brought all the way around to Asia. Now, there were some well-known people on this particular side of the movement. And so if you have a Tradescantia plant, then this particular group of gentlemen are kind of like, part of that plant name. So the trade scants receive seeds from the West Indies, right? So they are credited with getting the seeds from the West Indies, not from Spain, but from the West Indies to UK. So there's John the Elder and John the Younger. And this is where it gets crazy. And one, I wish I had this resume, but two, like something like this resume, maybe not the same context, but the scientists cannot agree if it is John the Younger or John the Elder that actually got the seeds that were sent from West Indies. So I was trying to figure out where in their lifetime could they have gotten these seeds. You know, the seeds were received between 1630 and 1634. So John the Elder, he started out with basically nothing. He worked his way up to be the keeper of gardens, vines, and silkworms at Oatlands, which was the palace for one of his queens, I believe. And then he also was the medicinal plant specialist at Oxford Physic Garden, which, is for the medical side of way back in the 1600s. And then Younger, he was actually getting ready to go on a expedition to Virginia to gather plants and seeds. So the question is did John the Elder get the seeds and then send them to Virginia with John the Younger, or did John Younger get the seeds because he was a sworn freeman of the Worcester Ship Company of Gardeners, and then brought them? Well, it's not known, so nothing agrees. I've read through it 1,000 times. So if anybody has any insight on that, I'm 100% happy to hear it. This is just my guess that it was probably John the Elder, based on the timeline. Then Philip Miller in 1731 started publishing the Gardener's Dictionary. And what he did, and he was the chief gardener at the Chelsea Physic Garden, super important guy. And what he did is he said, scarlet runner beans are really pretty, but you should eat them. And so he, in this whole guide, this Gardener's Dictionary, he then put in here all about how to plant them, where they're from, and then that you can actually eat them, because they were pretty. Everyone loved the flowers, but no, you can actually eat them. So he introduced them as food. And then cut to America in the 1800s. Bernard McMahon, if you're familiar with Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, he was kind of the mentor to Thomas Jefferson, and he was a seedsman and nursery owner in Philadelphia. He was also placed in charge of all accessions from the Lewis and Clark expedition, but he wasn't allowed to tell anybody that he had them. So he wasn't allowed to share, and that is like the biggest thing, I guess, in like 1800 was like, you wanted to share. Look at me, I'm a nurseryman. I have all this really cool stuff. I'm growing. He couldn't share any of that. He had to keep it quiet. So I guess that was kind of frustrating for him. But he wanted to also focus away from English gardening and more on American gardening and techniques. So he wrote the American Gardener's Calendar. And he was like, scarlet runner beans are great for shade. And they were grown at Monticello and throughout the East Coast. So then they moved over. I guess the thing is if you look at seed companies at that point in time from the 1800s on, they've been selling scarlet runner beans and Dutch runner beans from like the 1700s. So they were actively part of the seed catalog, but they were not popular. So instead now what we're looking at is, okay, we know they went through the states, right? So they're pretty much on like so many different seed catalogs, and you can get all kinds of varieties. Now my question, and the question that I'm stuck on still, is how did they get from Central America to the United States, especially Southern United States? How did I get Four Corners scarlet runner beans? I mean, it's not something that would be, it should be like easy to trace, but it's not. So most data is based on archaeological finds. And the big person on this was in the 1960s was Lawrence Kaplan, and he was the bean guru, right? So if you wanted to know about beans in archaeology, it was Lawrence Kaplan, and he wrote so many awesome papers. And so huge thank you to Susanna Abbey for this, because I would have never found this. But so he talked about how in the Verde Valley, so if you're familiar with Arizona, that's going to be Prescott kind of area, the Verde Valley. So they were there, but they never actually made it up to Mesa Verde. So they basically, the scarlet runner beans that they had were in the Verde Valley area. But that doesn't mean kind of a whole lot, because just because they didn't make it to Mesa Verde, it may be because they didn't grow well. There was a lot of different things. So Verde Valley was great. Now, when talking about the domestication, he basically just said, yes, they are in fact from this particular area, but we know they're in northern Mexico because they have a name, and they have, so once something gets a name, so in this case, in northern Mexico, they actually have their own name. Once they get that, they exist. So he did say that they moved up. And you can also just tell through seed accession. So like I work with native seed search sometimes as a farmer, but I also do a lot of research. So with them, they have an ADAPT site, and ADAPT is an acronym, but you can search for their accessions, which seed accessions, donations, or how they were given seeds. There's this one called Aztec White, and they were able to collect this from a farmer at the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico. So at some point in time, there were beans that actually were in. There still are. Excuse me. The beans came to the Santa Clara Pueblo. There's also the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System, or GRIN, which is another acronym. That one is, so like, for example, I pulled this particular bean from Puerto Rico, and I didn't catch the actual date on it, but I believe it was a 1963 accession. So this one is from Puerto Rico. Seed Savers Exchange. I love it. There's so many different beans that people are growing. So there's a Hungarian mix, there's like a Cooper's mix, and a black coat. So the biggest thing I thought was so cool with the Hungarian mix is that the directions are you plant them all together, right? So they're different colors, but you plant them all together. So you do not change any of the pollination to try to get one color. Every color is planted together, so you get what you get when you grow them out. And I think that's just really kind of cool. And why am I having an issue with tracing the routes on this side when it comes up the west? And that's mainly because traditional cultures in the Southwest rely on word of mouth and storytelling to maintain records. So while coming from Central America to Spain, you had documents and you had ship records, and people would write what they brought, and you have botanicals that are coming back saying, I brought this, I brought that. That's not the same kind of communication style. So there is a lot of mouth and everything by mouth and storytelling for record keeping. There's language barriers, so if you have different languages, or there's sometimes maybe they don't mix, and so what may be one thing in one language might be another. Limited access to trade routes and trading information. I mean, that was just not something that was kept track of. Cultural barriers. Seeds are life, seeds are family. It's not necessarily a commodity. I mean, at some point, you do have to look at it as a commodity when they were trading from a modern perspective, but it was not at that time. So some of the things that I've been told is basically that you're not, it's a payment, but it's not a payment. So if you're trading something, you're not looking at it as payments. You're looking at an exchange of goods with specific values that are important to the person. So that can be really hard for people to wrap their minds around in like kind of this maybe more capitalistic society. So it's not the same view. Like, when you brought seeds back to Spain, they were automatically had a value that was both botanical and maybe food, and then also maybe monetary. So yeah, it's really hard to navigate that. And if that's the end of my road, that's the end of my road. But I do have a lot more left to learn, and I'm always willing to hear more. And a huge thank you to Susanna Abbey for all the help. I was so stuck, and she helped me get out of it. And so, any questions?
Hi, Anita. Thank you so much the whirlwind tour, global tour of the Scarlet Runner Bean, for sure. Yeah, looking to see if there's any questions. I did have, one of the things that you did bring up was about the bean blossoms, right? It's actually interesting that you just bring that up, because we had a question come up in our exchange community that came to our exchange coordinator and was asking about specifically about eating bean blossoms, as well as just the stems of the plant. Do you have much experience with that, with eating the blossoms or the stems, or is it just specifically around the Scarlet Runner Bean?
I'm personally not a huge fan of eating anything that I don't know and haven't looked into. I have a past history as a herbalist and have gone through herbalist training, and one of the things that we're taught is like you just don't want to put something in your mouth until you actually know what's going to happen and where
Right.
your body is at that point.
Right.
So I tend to shy away from it, but my biggest my recommendation to them would be like, just do a little bit more research on it on their own. I
Yeah.
mean, we can answer the question like, yes, it's technically edible, but at what stage and things like that.
Yep. And
It was
within
used as food.
varieties, yeah, and within
Hmm.
varieties too, I think that has come up, right? Is you really have to know the plant, know the variety, have more
Hmm.
specifics around those than just going out and
Hmm.
assuming that because it's a bean that the blossoms are edible. So,
Hmm.
yeah, lots of great comments. You know, the history and the information about how these moves around, the work that goes into documenting, all of those things, and being able to kind of navigate and find those. It was interesting to see you putting that together and sharing that with us today, and some of even just like the clippings, right, with
Hmm.
the text in those original formats, and some of that was really great to see. There was we had somebody here early on that was mentioning let me take this one down first. The scientific names, right, and being able
Hmm.
to to put that up there and to kind of work through that.
Hmm.
Thanks for sharing that, and thanks for the attempts. I was saying it myself in my own head while you were pronouncing it. So no, great times. And again, so thank you so much for. We had somebody here that said, what were the sites again to identify some beans? I have one bean that I understand is from the Carolinas, was told it was contender, but have not been able to substantiate that.
So, okay, that's going to be the hard question because I don't really have any sites. Because the
Hmm.
biggest thing with beans is so scarlet runners are cross pollinated. Common bean, which is what pretty much everything else falls under, is more self pollinated. And really to get a good idea of what variety you have on hand and what variety you're told that you have is to actually compare. And sometimes that means going and doing some research in like that plant database I showed. And I'm gonna try to go back to it here and leave it there a second. This US National Plant Germplasm System. They sometimes have pictures where if it is like in this case it was the contender, then you can actually kind of compare the pictures of what you have. They're just
Hmm.
not great at that because these are from like the 1960s, 1970s. So a lot of it too is just going back and trying to find what an original contender looked like. You can use go to that biodiversity heritage library and look up those old seed catalogs because they'll have drawings of them and to see if that actually is. But it takes um, it pretty much takes some research. It's really hard to narrow it down because of just because they're separate pollen, they self pollinate doesn't mean they can't cross pollinate.
Right. So I have one last question here for you. It says, Anita,
Mhm.
what is your experience with the separate varieties of runner bean? Is there one in particular that does best in the heat of Arizona, New Mexico?
So I really do love the Four Corners Scarlet Runner Bean, because it is from the Four Corners, which is, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. It is, however, a controlled variety, because it is rare and we're growing it out. So That's a really hard one. As far as on the market, I don't love any of the varieties on the market right now for heat resistance. They're fine. I don't
Yep.
love what they do though.
Great. All right. Well, Anita, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you coming back and being with us. And again, if anybody has any additional questions that come up, Anita's information is within the WebEx platform for this conference, and so feel free to reach out her directly through that as well. So thanks, Anita.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, guys.
All right. Yep. Take care. Okay, and we're going to take just a really quick break. Anita was going to be here till noon. We're about 10 after. So we've got about 5 minutes, and then I'll come back in. And actually, this next piece is a recording from Nikki Rose, and it's a recorded presentation that'll go from 12:15 to about 12:40, and it's called Protecting Heirloom Seeds in Crete, Greece Through Education and Outreach. So I will come back on, and we will, I'll give a little bit of a bio and background of Nikki Rose, and I will put that up. And then for those of you that are interested, the next session after that, we'll take a break for lunch. And then at 1:00 p.m., Cindy Goodner, our development director, will be a host with Julia Skinner. And the title of that presentation is Our Fermented Lives, The Global History of Fermentation. So that looks to be a very great and interesting presentation as well. So I hope you can stay with us today, and we'll see you just in a couple minutes.